Hi everyone, welcome to today's super important session on flow security, navigating permissions and mitigating risks. If you don't know me, I'm Sima, the marketing webinar specialist at Salesforce Ben and your host for today's session. Before we get started, do drop down in the comments where you are tuning in from today. It's really nice to hear where everyone is tuning in from. So, as you're doing that, I'll get started. So in an era where data breaches are costing businesses millions, it's more important than ever for Salesforce admins to adopt a security-first mindset, especially when you're working with tools like Flow. So today's session is designed to equip you with the knowledge and the tools to protect your Salesforce org from potential security risks. We'll be covering Flow security fundamentals, guest user and system context considerations, as well as ongoing security management and future challenges before moving on to some resources and also the Q&A. And our speakers for today are Matt, a Salesforce CTA, author and CEO of EZProtect, and Shoby, Principal Architecture Evangelist at Salesforce. I'll leave you with them and we'll get started, but I'll pop back in for the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Simon. I really appreciate the intro. And Shoby, thanks again for taking time to join me on this session today. I think it's going to be very, very interesting. Fun fact for everyone: we actually did this session, another version of the session, a couple months back, and this is the updated new version of it. And hopefully, you're going to get a lot of value out of this.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So before we get started, I think I just wanted to ask for something really quick about Shoby. So what is it you're doing over there at I know you're at the Principal Evangelist. I know you got into architecture a while back, and so just curious.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am, as the title says, a Principal Architecture Evangelist here at Salesforce. So I'm actually a part of our well-architected and Salesforce Architects team. So if anybody out there, I'd love to hear from the folks in the comments. Everybody here has ever heard of architect.salesforce.com, utilize the well-architected framework, followed us on the blogs. So my role is as an evangelist. So a lot of what I do is create content for individuals who are trying to gain architectural thinking and try to create tools and resources for individuals who have architectural responsibilities inside organizations. I myself have been in the ecosystem about 17 years. Started off as a developer, building on platform. I think my first few weeks building was like literally, if anybody remembers Adobe Flex, Apex, Visualforce, when it literally had just come out, some Java and some .NET, just a lot of code. And then I think it was in 2009 where I got the role of an architect on an implementation for a client. So, and then pretty much been doing that ever since, but it's been a variety of roles for sure over the last 17 years.
Yep. Yeah, I can remember that as well. I think, I started about 18 years ago myself, and it started as a developer and up into moved up until worked Salesforce, and then jumped ship after a while and started EZProtect. And I think I've always been really big into just trying to figure out puzzles, and that's why I really liked architecture, and I just naturally dove into that. And as you know, I've been really focused on security a lot lately, and I think that's why we wanted to share this talk. I mean, before we move on, I think one thing I just wanted to share a little interesting fun fact about myself. I think everyone, I think security is one of those dry topics that it's really hard to talk about, hard to get people excited about, of course, because it seems like a lot of times that's one of those things that's just in the way. And instead, I think what we want to try to do is get it to the point where it's super important. As you know, trusted is the first pillar in the well-architected framework, and so that's the first thing people really should be thinking about is security, and not the last thing. And I think people, I think, just try to brush it aside sometimes, thinking, oh, it's just something getting in my way. Where if you don't think about it, then you're gonna really get into some big trouble. I think a lot of this is kind of like my personal story is like homeowners insurance. I've told this to a few people. It's a lot of people don't like paying for homeowners insurance. You don't like getting it, but if you don't plan accordingly, then you could find yourself in trouble. And I, personally, my house actually caught on fire once, so I'm actually really glad I had that homeowner's insurance and I had those fire extinguishers in the house, and I did plan for something, to happen in the future. So anyway,
absolutely.
so moving on to flow security fundamentals. So I think, firstly, I just want to talk a little bit about, what, everyone is, a lot of people are familiar with Flow. That's, Salesforce's declarative-based workflow builder. I think it's come a long way, but I think a lot of people don't really think about in the context of security in Flow with flows, and especially how those apply in digital experience sites. And so I think, first, generally, I'd like to get your opinion, or just a little bit of like what people should be thinking really about in when building flows and digital experiences.
No, absolutely. I think one of the things that people tend to maybe lean on or take advantage of, right, is that, and sometimes you see this notion out there of like low code, no code is inherently secure. Pro code is inherently insecure, right? And the reality of it is the way that it's built on top of the Salesforce platform is, like you said, Matt, right? Both been on the building on the platform, right? And when Apex was the only option, workflow was the only option, insecure S controls were the only option, right? And S controls were grievously insecure, right? I think people forget about that. We joke about, oh, they're old, but they were grievously insecure. And the reality was they were insecure because it was based on what the browser could allow, right? If the browser were more secure, then it wouldn't be as accessible. The apps wouldn't be as accessible. Therefore, you wouldn't get the adoption that you want. Therefore, that app is no longer useful. So I think what ends up happening is when people say, okay, I'm going to lean on flow and I'm going to lean on low and no in order to create some of these experiences for customers, external users, partners on PRM, that they think that, okay, I can just simply take what I've built for internal and simply make it accessible to guest users, right? Where it's just like, okay, yeah, they can access it, no big deal. But one of the massive challenges there is that the same rules apply. The same exact rules apply around if you want to secure data in within your internal org, where for many reasons, some people just sort of see some data. It's the same way with flow as well, right? And I think a lot of it boils down to of like, are people building flows well first in regards to security? Because when it comes to digital experiences, you should have a security mindset first, right? Because all of a sudden, to your point, right? Like, it's almost like homeowner's insurance, or if it's like, your home having a front door and a back door, you kind of need to lock both, right? The back door may be a little bit more inaccessible because you could be surrounded by forest, and you may think, well, the front door is the most accessible, right? No, both are relatively insecure. So you kind of have to, run for both. So I'd say that's why, one of the things on flow is don't lean on that it's, clicks as code. Don't lean on that you could very easily just check a box, allow guest user access on that flow, and now all of a sudden it can show up on your Experience Cloud site. You should really think about what your data is doing in the context of the client browser and the flow engine before you do any of that.
Yep, and I completely agree with that as well. I think it's really it's about thinking about the entire platform in general. When you're building anything on the platform, you're thinking about, okay, what data can people access, and even flow, whether it's code, or whether it's just building your digital experience out of the box. I think all of it is really thinking about the data, right? What data can people access? What can they get to, and what features even sometimes can they take advantage of when you're configuring those sites? And of course, digital experiences just make that a little bit even more of a risk to organizations when you start configuring it, because then you're not only exposing that internally, but you're exposing that externally. Then you plug things like flow in, code in, and then if you have not secured those properly, then your data could be exposed, or even worse, they could manipulate those inputs that are coming in, or the outputs coming out, getting data they shouldn't get in those digital experience sites, right?
Yeah. I mean, within the framework, one of the key anti-patterns that we have with flow is people use get all records in Flow, and I think it's a great piece of functionality, right? Where it's like you get the data you need, you don't have to write discrete SOCL, you don't have to worry about any of that. But then what ends up happening is that all of that data, I think people forget, shows up on the client side. Whether or not it becomes visible in the UI is depending on the mapping you do to that screen, but the data is cached in the browser. So now all of a sudden, not everybody with like any kind of particular skill set, just the ability to right click on a site and say, and just basically check the cache on the page. And then all of a sudden they're seeing a bunch of JSON show up. That's your data, right? That's your get all record data. So that's a key like anti-pattern that people should definitely look to in flows in general, but especially flows within digital experiences.
Exactly. And then I think I want to also move on to just talking a little bit about what are the types of, I guess, I think just thinking about what are the type of permissions available in Flow? What should people be thinking about when they're building those flows? I think one of them, like you said, just talking about what kind of records they can access. I know there's also the big thing we'll be talking a little bit deeper later. You've got just like in Apex code, you can run in system mode or you can run in user mode. For those of you who don't understand what system mode is, that basically means you're running as an admin for all sakes and purposes. So you can get to records you shouldn't. So in digital experiences, that's bad, especially if you're the guest user running as in that in those contexts. So you want to be careful of what context you're running in, and then of course the users themselves that are accessing that data. What kind of data are they accessing? What kind of things are you running into on those?
No, absolutely. And I think that's where, system versus user context, like I said, I'm an old school Apex person myself too. It's like it advented when we came out with and without sharing, right? And it's the same exact capability. Like I know that people lean on it and it seems like a very like, oh, this is a very simple way to get the data I need to raise it up to customers. Right. But as well, Matt, like you gotta audit that against what your organization will allow from a compliance and a security perspective, right? You can't simply say, oh, because the functionality allows for it, we should use it. No, like what should you be revealing and what should you not be revealing? And running in user means that you can now lock it down from a guest user perspective. Running in system means it's effectively running the way that you are as the builder. They get the same access you are now getting as the individual actually building the application itself. And that should be terrifying for most.
Oh, exactly. And I mean, speaking of terrifying, I think one thing as you know, I've recently released a book about a personal experience of my own where some data was exposed in a digital experience site because it was not locked down appropriately. I think this Steve Simpson told me that, and I've done a couple of talks with him, a really great guy, but he said the day Salesforce becomes insecure is the day that you start configuring it. And so that's why it's that shared responsibility model. So if you start configuring Salesforce incorrectly, then you may be opening the door. Salesforce is giving you the tools, but if you don't use those tools correctly, then you could be exposing your data. And that's kind of the QR code you see here is a link to my book if you want to learn a little bit more about how that happened and certain things that you should be thinking about when you're configuring your digital experiences. So anyway, I want to move on to the next topic here, which I think we covered pretty well the overall of digital experiences and flows. But now let's talk about Apex and flows. I think this is also a whole nother layer people really don't think about. So people develop classes, and then you can easily plug those classes into flows. It's very powerful. You can, this is great for certain things. And when I tell people designing flows, I like to use flows as kind of your business logic driver and then kind of let Apex do the heavy lifting. And that's really great if you want to do some heavy processing and more complex. It makes your flow a lot more complicated than it should be. But also I think there's some considerations that people should be thinking about when they are adding Apex to the flows. It's not just add any Apex class, because just like the flow itself, those Apex classes could be exposing or gaining access to people that are malicious, that could be exposing some data, correct?
No, absolutely. And I think that's where some of it isn't even it's like, well, I'm not using without sharing in my Apex class. I'm just using with sharing. That should be secure, right? I think I'm set, right? Not necessarily, right? Like there are, it really depends on how that Apex, Apex method, Apex class is functioning in the context of that flow. What kind of data is it passing in? What kind of data is it pushing, like, out from an IO perspective, from the parameters? A lot of it is also what are the data transactions of the Apex class itself, right? How modularized is it, right? Is it doing a check on permissions and accessibility within the method itself, right? Like one of the powerful tools of Apex is that you have the ability to, within the context of the user, check what they should or should not be doing, what they can or cannot be doing, right? So utilizing that, especially in the context of a flow, is often it may seem like sometimes it's like overkill, but it does add an element of security, like security that it it really is an overkill, right? Because that class may run in a completely different context from scope to scope. It may be used in different scopes as well. So it's always sure, like, don't just lean on that. Oh, the flow's got the check, on user permissions. That's fine. It's running in user context. No, you could also use some of those. Accessibility is readable. A lot of those methods and the metadata checks that you can do in Apex as well. You should be using that as well in there.
Yep, that's correct. And and I think one of the other things that is important to mention about, just so maybe some people are asking, well, I mean, what's the big deal? I mean, the flows are kind of running on their own. How could people really get to the data in those flows? Well, I think one of the things that people don't really realize is, everything that's powering the Lightning front end are run by a bunch of APIs.
Yeah.
And so if you know what you're doing, and there's a lot of penetration testing tools people can use out there and other tools, you can actually execute flows without interacting with the user interface. And you can pass variables into flows if it has input variables, just like an Apex class. And then if you're able to manipulate the data with those variables, then you could actually make that flow go through a different pathway. So I think we talked about, this is one of the bullets that we had down at the bottom, are mega flows. And what we're calling mega flows is where you have these flows that are these gigantic flows with lots of branches, and sometimes people even use security for branching. Well, what if
Yeah.
someone manipulated one of those inputs, and maybe the input is dependent on what type of security they're having? And then all of a sudden now you're going down a different branch with having access that you shouldn't. So I think that this is kind of where people really need to be thinking about, not just building the flows, but the inputs themselves could drive exposed security risks. And then the same thing if you are having these modularized flows, and then you're having inputs, but then you have outputs so that you can produce those outputs to another flow. Well, those outputs also can be consumed via these APIs. So you need to be making sure that this data is secure, and you're not passing the sensitive data across between these flows, if at all possible. But I think the same thing goes for these Apex classes too. Apex classes, just like flows, have inputs and outputs. So I think
Yeah.
the key is, whether you're doing declarative, low code, no code, or actual Apex class, then you need to make sure that whatever you're passing in, you're not really able to manipulate the operation of those Apex classes to do something that you don't intend to do, or something that destructive. And same thing, you couldn't manipulate those parameters to return something that you shouldn't be seeing as the end user.
Yeah. And one of the key elements of it as well is also like two parts. Like the first part is, like, web applications will behave however they behave, right? Like one of the things I tell everyone is that if your flow or if your Apex doesn't have good fault or error handling, it may be, you may understand exactly what is the flow control of this specific flow and this Apex. But exactly to your point, Matt, like if someone malicious comes in, just runs a base level pen test, and then decides just to turn the knob a little up on the pen test, where now all of a sudden it's doing maybe 500 execution paths, just random execution paths, to see what output is coming back to the view state. Now, all of a sudden, without proper error handling, without proper like fault handling, you're sending back data in context that maybe you shouldn't have been. It's failing at particular points that was like, oh, that was just I was just getting all records. Why is it failing? Well, it may not have been appropriate to scale. So one of the things that we're also suggesting is that even as a pattern, like I'm going to give a brief like reference. So on the architect site, we have the well-architected framework. We also have amazing decision guides, right? And those decision guides allow you to choose what is the right tool for what is the right use case. One of the recent decision guides that were released by our product manager, Tom Letty, is around asynchronous processing. So one of the things that we also suggest as a pattern is utilize asynchronous processing more. Like if you got to do complex DML, if you got to do in the context of a flow that's using a lot of Apex or Apex, that's driving a lot of Apex or just flow, a lot of flow, the more asynchronous you make it, like specific database transactions, the less likely that malicious individual is able to affect or get data back if it's synchronous. So that's why even now more and more we're suggesting, those asynchronous processes too, along with proper error and fault handling, like however you use flow.
Yep, exactly. Because I mean, that's a good point with the asynchronous processing, because since it's asynchronous, they're not going to get that immediate response back. And so it's in a different transaction running, so that it's away from where the malicious user is going to be. Obviously, with asynchronous, you also have to think about other things such as usability. And with your end users, your end user need to have those results back immediate. What kind of impacts is that doing? Is that on that end user as well? So I think there's that balance between I think with everything, with security and usability, but of course, you don't want to err on exposing data just so a user can use an app. But at the same time, you also want to make sure that it is still usable, because I've said this many times, if you want complete security, then you can lock everything in a room with no doors, no windows, but then it's completely unusable. At the same token, if you open all the doors up, have no doors, no windows, then anyone can get in, anyone can steal your data, and no one's going to want to use the app anyway. So I think there's that balance, because I think the whole point with security is it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when is going to happen. It will happen to you at some point in time. It's just how you have mitigated things and broken things up to reduce the impact of that risk.
Absolutely.
Yep. So one other thing I just wanted to touch on here before we move on to the next slide, or just a little bit, I think some of these best practices with Apex. We've kind of talked about a few things, but I think the main one that comes to mind for me is really just being, like you said, I think one is using the asynchronous you just mentioned, also being cognizant of what classes you've exposed. So I think the same thing goes for whether it's you're doing this in flow, in Lightning components. You want to make sure that you're not exposing methods in an Apex class that shouldn't be exposed to that user that's running them. A lot of people, what they do is they are designing Apex classes, and they put them all by business function and not security function, where instead what you should be doing is breaking up your Apex classes by security function. So only the classes meant for an admin run as an admin, as your sales user only runs as that sales user. Because anything that you've exposed to Aura in those methods is going to be accessible to the user running running that flow, or running that Lightning component. And so really the big first part is locking down and separating your Apex classes out so that they're not accessible to that user. I think the same thing could be a similar pattern you could also do probably with your flows, because I think you can also assign what flows people can use. So being careful to not creating, as we said, these mega flows that have multiple personas of security in it, separating those out as well, so that you have only the right people that should be running those instead of running in a system context.
Yeah. I mean, the mega flows, are ripe for anybody with just any kind of, capable penetration testing ability of, like, if I ever saw a mega flow, I think that would be the first test that I would run. Just how many different execution paths can this mega flow do? And that's the challenge, is that if you think like, okay, I've just built this one giant flow that will rule them all, and it will conquer all these things. Now all of a sudden you're not having to secure against maybe 4 or 5 execution paths. It could be 55, 60, right? Where now each execution path requires its own audit from a security perspective, right? Now I know that gets folks like Matt and myself excited, because now all of a sudden it's like, all right, we got stuff, like we're going to make you secure. But in the end, the first recommendation we'll probably usually make is split this up so you reduce the amount of vulnerabilities, because like the more execution paths you add to any automation at all, like, and it's not discretely composed, like it's going to be, it's not even that it could be as secure as you make it, but you can't track every possible execution path within a runtime. You just can't. So the more you reduce, the better off you are, honestly, in that context.
Yep. And I think when we talked about this in our last talk that we had as well, was that this again is a balance. So your mega flows obviously pose a risk, because you've got these multiple different paths running in system mode. So the doors are all open. If you can find the right pathway, you're going to get access today. You shouldn't. But at the same token, if you break that up into smaller flows, now you're having a lot of these flows with inputs and outputs. So now you need to be cognizant about what those inputs and outputs can do. So I don't think there's nothing you really can do on either way, but I still feel like the breaking it up is still safer than having these mega flows that someone could take advantage of, like you and me.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I'll also call out is we're talking about security, right? But the more you make your flows or your Apex, whatever, composable, like one of the things that I worked on a couple of months ago was with Adam White, who's our product manager on flows, like was just a blog on this issue, right? Screen flows, external access. Like, and what we kept noticing over and over again was like, oh, there's a great performance pattern that's happening by doing this. Great performance. Now all of a sudden, you're not just getting the benefit of security, you're getting the benefit of performance as well, right? Because typically in a denial of service situation, when they throw everything at you, like, Matt, like they're hoping for a denial of service. They're hoping to see what they can get from that. So that's why one of the key benefits of working on those security, creating those security, using those security patterns, is that you also get the performance benefit as well, and that helps against other kind of like individuals who may come after you.
Exactly. And then also talking about like maintainability and just traceability. So if you have these mega flows, it's going to be very hard to understand what are all those pathways, where are your gaps in there. And if you break them up into smaller flows, then you have smaller pieces to troubleshoot, smaller pieces to understand where your security gaps are as well, versus this mega flow is just a monster. It's just same thing with an Apex class that has 3,000 lines. It's going to take a lot of time to debug. How do you know that you've not exposed something? It's a lot to dig into. But if you take it into smaller pieces, I think it's like a puzzle. Like if you have this giant puzzle, you have to look at every single piece. But if you have little smaller pieces, then you can see at least what's going on in each one of those pieces.
Absolutely.
Right. So all right, great. So let's talk about the guest user and the functionality. I'm going to go back to about my book because I'm focused on the guest user and these Lightning APIs, because if you're not appropriately securing your data with the guest user and you start opening the door. So for example, if you're sharing data with the guest user, if you're running things in system mode with the guest user, then you could use these Lightning APIs again without accessing the UI to get to the same data, get to those flows that the guest user is using. So I think I know we've dug a little bit into the system context, but let's talk a little bit more about it's the risk of using system context with guest user flows.
Yeah, and a lot of it you kind of have to understand, like a good example for a guest user is often like the use case that they'll use of putting a flow in front of a guest user is a screen flow, right? It could be I want to set up an appointment for my technician to come in and repair my internet, or I want to set up a medical appointment at a physician's office, like something where you want to essentially gather data. Or it could be a situation in which, like, okay, I want to see what are my latest appointments, or I want to see what are my orders, et cetera, right? It's either information collection, that. And when you're in the context of a screen flow, one of the things I think we forget is like a lot of the data that comes up and shows up on the screen, it's like is how the flow engine works, right? The flow engine, people always make that assumption that the flow engine is purely and only a back-end thing. It's something that Salesforce handles. It's purely on our server side. It happens on that. But more and more, as you look at, capabilities like, React.js and others, like reactive components, right? Essentially, like components that can react to what's happening on the UI. Now, like when you click on something, all of a sudden it goes to another screen and it goes immediately. It goes like that, right? Where's that context of data being stored? Well, in order to make that work, in order to make that optimized, amazing, beautiful screen flow experience, we're storing that data on the user layer. We're storing that data on the UI. And we're completely and utterly storing it on the UI because that's the user experience, right? That's how it works, right? It's not going to shake hands back with the flow engine to check that you've done the right or wrong thing. It's going to assume that you're working within the context of the flow that was built, especially if it's a screen flow. So that's why the reason I kind of prefaced all this, right, is because when we look at a screen flow and it's running in the context of a system, one of the anti-patterns we talked about earlier was get all records. Now, if you've got reactive components and if you run get all records, like reactive components just going to tell, all it knows is what you've designed for the UI to do. So it's going to grab all that data and it's going to keep all that data. It's going to store it right within a nice little JSON formatted value that you can right click on and find, right? And then all of a sudden it's going to pull on that data when it needs to. But remember, it's on the UI. It's on the browser level. You can easily access that data the same way that you're accessing the UI itself. So that's why when we talk about system context and get all records and your flows, like I think people underestimate like exactly how much data is going to the UI that you can't see as a common user, but as someone who uses some of these tools in order to get into the browser level and debug the browser's view state, you can actually access that data very easily. So that's something to keep in mind when it comes to a lot of these.
Yep. And I think for our audience here, let's break this down into a simple use case as well to illustrate this a little bit more. I think it'd be interesting. So let's just, because I know a lot of the guest user functionality, so submission of cases or like surveys, a lot of other things. So let's just say, for example, maybe it's you're submitting a healthcare application, and this creates a case for the healthcare application. But maybe let's say in that flow, you want to see if they have any previous applications they filled out. Maybe they can have previous ones. So you're going to get all records for all the previous applications. And because this is a healthcare application, maybe you have social security number on their birthday, maybe medical conditions that they have suffered, anything like that. And because this is a guest user flow, nothing's locked down. And maybe what I do in the flows, I put in my social security number to find the information, and it pulls my social security number, loads all that stuff into the data. So I think this is kind of what you're illustrating. Now all of that sensitive PHI information is now on the browser layer, publicly exposed there. That anyone that's hijacking their session, or just anyone that could see all that data that's sensitive, that's being stored there, right?
Absolutely. And that's why even inside of the well-architected framework, right, before we even talk about data security, we talk about data security all the time, but one of the first things that we cover is actually org security, right? Authorization, authentication. Exactly to your point, Matt. Like if someone decides to hijack your session in order to get your data, it's not like, we try to make it as hard as possible, obviously, as a company, right? Hard, not impossible. That's why we're having that discussion. So now, and remember, you could be utilizing tools like, well, but Matt, we've got that data secured. We use Shield, we're encrypting it. And like, why would it show up that way if it's being encrypted? Sure. It's being encrypted on the database at rest. But once you're bringing it up on the UI layer, it could be a whole different story of how it's used. So that's a key element of it as well. Don't lean on what you think it's doing.
Exactly. And then also, as we're saying here, one of the first bullet is system context and guest user flows. I mean, my perspective is don't do it.
No, never.
I mean, unless you absolutely have to, but then you're opening the door for a big risk. Same thing with Apex classes in running in system context as a guest user. someone could easily manipulate that, and you're going to get stuff back. And also, as we said, you could potentially be getting records or storing on the UI layer that then anybody could see. So, I mean, what if you're just trying to cache some cases or other things? Other stuff I wanted to ask you about is form fields. So, in my example above, someone's putting in that social security number into the flow to now retrieve, these case data. Would that still be another thing that could be potentially exposed on the UI layer? That
No,
input
absolutely.
going to there?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Because in that session hijack, I mean, people can be using something as simple as like a screen recording or a lot of different capabilities, right, in order to get that data. Like that's why, even like utilizing patterns on your user experience of just like data masking, right? People often wonder, well, why is my password being masked? I'm the one typing it in. Why is it being masked? Well, you also don't know who's recording your screen. You also don't know who's looking at it along with you. So like, and remember, like, and you can also mask. There are particular ways in JavaScript where you can mask it. But one of the overall suggestions that we make is that, like, if you're going to input that kind of data, then whatever field, like you're using a field mapping, make sure it's strongly typed. Right. I think that's one of the things that people kind of lose sight of. They're like, well, it's a simple form. I just need to grab exactly your point, man. I just need to grab some address data, maybe their last 4 digits, their social, no big deal. I just need to grab it in a text field. Right. And if it's not a strongly typed field, a field that's designed, then you are adding, to those implications for security. So, yeah, I mean, like that is also a possibility. So, like I said, if you need to capture that data, make sure it's strongly typed, make sure to use other methods. I mean, Matt, what are some other methods you recommend for that kind of specific input?
And sorry, what was the question again?
Oh, what were some of the, we talk about like these kind of like PII, PHI, like, let's say it's like my patient number if I'm a part of a clinical trial.
Oh yeah.
Right. Like what are some of those other recommendations? Like for me, it's always like go strongly typed, utilize masking as best as possible. You don't know who's recording your screen. I mean, what else do you recommend?
I'm sorry, I'm just drawing a blank.
No, it's all good. Like I said, it's a funny one, right? It's a funny one.
Yeah, it is. I mean,
because
I think it's a hard one because it's like,
yeah.
I mean, also I was just thinking of a different use case with that same thing, which
Yeah.
was, and I think this is a perfect segue to this is how best practices for handling sensitive data in public facing flows, which we talked about before was URL query string variables. So a lot of times people pass in query string parameters to preload the page and data, passing that through a Visualforce page. But then a lot of times you could be passing maybe sensitive data first off in the query string, or I think one example that you gave before was order numbers. So if you have like an order that's, order number, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then, well, I could probably just put in 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then I get someone else's order. And if that order has sensitive information, or maybe it's not an order, maybe it's a patient record or something like that. So, I mean, I think these are some other things that, I think about as far as for best practices for handling security. And if you are going to do like URL parameters, I mentioned this when we were talking last time, maybe it's better to do, instead of just passing just the straight parameters in URL, then you could do so people cannot manipulate that URL, sign the URL. So that way you're putting like basically an encryption on the URL. So if someone changes it, it doesn't work, because you have some protection so that they cannot manipulate that URL. Or as what you were saying, do a post, don't do a get, because at least in the post, it's in the body and it's being encrypted, versus if you're just doing a standard get, then it's just clear text with those parameters being sent in.
Yeah. I mean, essentially ensuring obviously that all your transactions are over like port 443 versus port 80 is critical, right? Just base level TLS. Actually, like it's always important, and even in the context of like, and I think that's a lot of talk about is when looking at public facing those, like we're really like what's interesting, maybe people have noticed, is that we're talking about the browser, right? We're not talking about the triangle of security when it comes to flow, right? Because when we talk about public facing flow, it's really the browser, right? You can make it as secure as possible utilizing the techniques of the platform. You could use Shield to make it optimally encrypted. You could use 443. But then once that flow loads in the browser, right, and hopefully you're utilizing it behind authentication, you're not just putting it on like just a random page using API calls, now all of a sudden, like you need to understand what that interaction looks like. That's where that insecurity becomes completely prevalent, right? Specifically for these public facing ones as well, whether they're screen flows or not, they could literally just be flows that are running in the back end now. But remember, like from a transaction perspective, it's running in the context of that user. So it's not difficult to gain access to it.
Yep, exactly. And I know we touched a little bit on the subflows as well. So I think that's we could just do a quick recap, and then we can move on. I know we're just about out of time for the talk. We're about to move to Q&A.
Oh yeah,
but
it's a fun and terrifying topic.
Yep, exactly. I think subflows and guest user, I think it's just really the same thing that we were saying before. Make sure you understand your inputs. Don't put those in system mode. Anything in system mode is, if you're having inputs, even higher risk that you could return other data that you shouldn't have access to as a guest user. I think the guest user, personally, I think Salesforce has done a great job locking down a lot of the things you can do with the guest user, but I think Apex and flows are still one of those areas that you can really get a little bit, exposed data in your organization without really knowing about it or meaning to know about it, because they still allow system context in flows, in both Apex and flows, actually.
Yeah, I mean, there are use cases that we get from customers all the time. Like what we will say is, if you have to use system context, separate it out into specific subflows and do not use get all records. Use records sparingly, not just on your get, but also when you're creating data to store variables on, when you're instantiating your record, right, within flow. Don't just do, okay, I'm going to grab all the data from this and just store all of it. No, you get what you need. Get what you need. And especially if that data is going to be driving DML, right? Specific DML logic, make sure that it's only mapping the data it needs. That way, and you may be saying, well, if I'm not doing get all, do I really need to make it that discrete? Can I just say whatever you give me, you give me? No, because if they hijack it and all of a sudden they're submitting more malicious data into your system that shouldn't be submitted, there's an issue, right? So yeah, so like that's one of the key elements that I always suggest. Like, if you got to use system context, don't use get all records. Instantiate your records very sparingly with specific fields that are mapped to what you're getting, and then same exact on DML. Instantiate specific what you're getting. That's a key recommendation.
Yep, exactly. I think this goes back to the example I was giving with the returning the patient data. So if you're getting all data, maybe there's social security numbers in there. Maybe there's sensitive information. Now you're exposing it to the browser. Granted, you probably still could get to that data in a different way. You shouldn't be exposing that at all to a guest user or an authenticated user. But at least if you're not showing it on the browser, someone that's just doing scanning the session could hopefully wouldn't be able to grab some of that data. So anyway, I just want to really quickly go through just talking about on a general broad security perspective. I mean, I think this is you said there's some assets that you've been, I don't know if you're able to talk about it or not, but creating for this, but also I think just generally from a security perspective, this is something that's a pretty standard visual of how to think about security in general. It's making sure you're starting with preparing. I think it's just more about handling incidents, really, is what this is talking about.
No, absolutely.
First, the preparation. That's what we're talking about here. Everything here is preparation, making sure you're preparing for that incident. But what we talked about before was it will happen at some point in time. So then you should be able to identify it, notify people. And then what we talked about first is the containment is the most important part, making sure that you can contain it to a smaller incident rather than a larger one that it happens. So anyway, this is kind of just, I'll let you, if you want to add a little bit more context to this, but I think this is a great visual just depicting of, how the life cycle of incident management works.
Yeah. Only thing I'll quickly shout out is if you go to the well-architected framework and you look at our adaptable pillar, within it is resilience. And within resilience, we talk about incident response, right? It's great content. Take a look at it. Like even just recently, I've had a chance to go deep into it on some particular customer use cases. One thing I'll tell everybody is just like, don't focus on the fix, focus on getting out of the incident, right? And the content within the framework does a great job of doing it. So that's where I'll point to everybody is check out incident response within the adaptable pillar of well-architected.
Yep, exactly. And also don't try to I mean, don't try to go to that nth degree. I mean, it's good to make sure your stuff, everything is secure, but also don't to that degree where then it's completely unusable, as I said. I mean, I think it's more about, like you said, containing it, getting into smaller pieces, making your risk exposure low or small. But then if you keep focusing entirely on how can I make it so 100% never get any kind of attack, well, that attack will happen no matter what you do. It's just making sure that you have the right steps in place to shut it down quickly, identify it. You've done everything you can to stop an attack in the first place, but then also when an attack does happen, your exposure is low and you're able to act on that very quickly and recover from it.
Absolutely.
All right, so the last thing, and then we can go up into Q&A. So basically, just talking a little bit about Gen AI and flows. And specifically, I wanted to focus on things like the guest user with Gen AI. So I think a lot of people really, especially as it's coming in more into play with flows and everything, people are not really thinking about this, I think, in the context of digital experiences and users. So I just want to pose the question here: is like, if what would you think about for Gen AI as in the guest user context? What risks would you think that poses?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like we could spend probably an hour just on this as well, right? But here's what I'll tell everybody who's watching, right? This or the recording is when we look at top of mind, like like right now, like Dreamforce is next week, right? And if anybody's seen the announcements, we're talking a lot about obviously generative AI, data, some of our Agent Force release. I don't think we have a forward-looking statement on this one, so I'm just going to keep it as high level as possible, right? But one of the key things that's driving so much of the power of Agent Force and generative AI are our automation tools within Salesforce. It's Flow, it's Apex, it's all of that. So now if you have this agent who can now just run obviously within your internal inside context, but now they can also run in an external customer user context. There are a tremendous amount of implications, right? And like I could literally spend an hour on it right now as we kind of prep for Dreamforce. But here's what I'll put, right? For those individuals who really want to see it in action, right? We're going to be announcing a lot of this at Dreamforce. Check out the main keynote. We'll talk about later. Also, you have the ability to get hands-on and Trailhead on a lot of the Agent Force capabilities so that you can kind of see what that is. And then we could probably articulate in more detail in the future of like, what are some of those challenges? Because yeah, it introduces quite a few.
Yep. I think the first thing that comes to mind, especially from the guest user perspective, is if you're using Gen AI as the guest user and you're using it in system context, you've basically just opened the door for that for the Gen AI engine to potentially expose lots of sensitive data. And I think that's even more important to make sure that you're running in user context mode if you are using Gen AI, and being careful on what kind of responses that it can return back, not only just hallucinations, but also sending back data that it shouldn't, because the Gen AI doesn't know it's running as a non-privileged, as a guest user, because you've set it as running in system context mode. And now it has access to a lot of more data than it probably should in returning those responses back. So I can think of use cases like case creation. If you're submitting a case and you've opened it up into system context mode, now it can look at all your cases, all that data, all that PHI that's in there, that PII that's in there, and potentially could expose it. I mean, I know there's still the trust layer and all that. We won't get too much into that, but I think still there's a potential of that. So I just say be careful when you're using any kind of Gen AI tools in digital experiences, especially as a guest user, and do not use it in system context mode.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I'll advise folks is, as you guys are looking at our announcements next week, like if you follow Mark at all online, like you hear about RAG all the time, like retrieval augmented generation. RAG is actually an extremely powerful tool to be able to get structured and unstructured data, not just from Data Cloud, but also from CRM data, also from files. Basically, every single kind of data source known to humanity that is accessible within your org is now accessible by Einstein and generative and Agent Force itself. So that the implications there are obviously significant, right? Because now that prompt is getting it from so many data sources. But to your point, Matt, we have the trust layer, right? But in the end, the trust layer is exactly the same kind of trust methodology we utilize across all of our applications, right? The trust that we have on the front end, the trust that we have on data security. But as an individual, regardless of your role, it's also important to understand what are the implications, like beyond just hallucinations. It could even be gathering data sources and data points that by design, the prompt should be getting, but when it's in front of the user, it's portraying it in a way that's not by design. And that's not even a hallucination. Sometimes we say like, well, it could be hallucinating. Sometimes it could literally be doing, well, we gave it the data and it's presenting it that way. It's not presenting anything crazy, just showing data it shouldn't be, and like, and nowadays, even on RAG, we're not even treating it as like a hallucination anymore. We're like, oh, wait a minute. We need to figure out some sort of defense against this. So yeah, so definitely next week, there'll be a lot around it. Like, can't promise it's all secure, right? But in the end, like, you'll get a better grasp of like what those emerging challenges are and what's the future security risk or security needs could be if you include like Agentforce and generative AI into your flow, into your work.
Yep, exactly. That's a excellent point there. So, anyway, so to wrapping up here, here's some security resources that you can look at. Or first off is join us at the Salesforce Ben Hub at the Dreamforce. You can register; it's an open registration. Anyone can go. Second is, if you haven't already clicked the QR code, grab a copy of my book, Securing Digital Experiences. I'll be there in the Salesforce Ben Hub signing copies all throughout Dreamforce. And then last, if you're interested in file prevention in Salesforce doesn't scan files uploaded for viruses. And so what we do is we scan files for viruses in Salesforce to protect your data from other additional threats that we've not really gone into in this call here. So that will help you understand a little bit more about that. But anyway, I think just generally wrapping up the topic today, and then we'll move up to Q&A. First thing, I think the biggest thing out of this is, be cognizant of what data comes in and out of your flows. When you're creating your flows, remember that anything that comes in could also be manipulated. Anything coming out could also be intercepted on the browser. Stay away from those mega flows if you want to making sure that, because those could be a security risk, and also not able to maintain and try not to run anything in system mode. Same thing with your Apex classes. Be careful of that, to try to implement your Apex classes so that you're understanding or enforcing security at the user layer, even if the flow is running in system mode. Anything else, Shoby, I missed there?
No, I think you pretty much hit it, everybody, right? Like, it's very easy to give a flow guest user access, see if it's worth doing that, or do you need to replicate it with a little bit more security? And if you need to do system context for any reason, like, I don't know what, like, don't use get all records and instantiate your objects and your DML within the flow very discreetly, specific fields.
Okay, great. Thanks. All right, I guess we can open up for Q&A now. Any questions with the 7 minutes we have left on this session?
Amazing. Thanks, Matt and Shoby.
And then while Simon's coming back in, Shoby, if you want to do a quick call out for the Architect keynote.
Yeah, absolutely. So Dreamforce is next week. Yay. Right. So one of the things that, like, when we talk about it, Dreamforce, obviously we talk about the great stuff around generative AI, data security. So the Architect keynote will be running, I believe, Wednesday evening towards the end of the day in person. If you want to watch it virtually, thank you for putting those links up. You can watch it on Salesforce Plus as well on the following day. And it'll be broken up into trusted, easy, adaptable. We talked a lot about security. One of the great things is that in our trusted section inside of the keynote, we talk a lot about the new security capabilities coming into not just good old-fashioned Salesforce platform and CRM, but also a lot of the new security capabilities we're introducing into Data Cloud, and also a lot of the new security capabilities that we're introducing into Agentforce and our generative AI and Einstein capabilities, and how essentially you can control almost all of security from a specific place, because you can add, like, actually, I won't spoil it too much, but it's actually pretty cool what we've done with security. And we're going to articulate it not just with product reviews during the keynote, but you'll also see great, like, drawing and diagramming of, like, the actual security implementations themselves as they exist across CRM and platform, Data Cloud, generative AI, regardless of where they are. I believe the theme that we're calling on the demo is security everywhere. So it'll be really great.
Nice.
Amazing. Thanks. I've popped the links in the chat if you would like those as well. Does anyone have any questions for Shoby and Matt?
So I've got a question for you, Matt. So one of the things that you talked about is, especially in the context of, insecurity and all that. So like the virus stuff and the file stuff is very fascinating to me, because I know that's a specialty of yours, what you guys do. Like what are the kinds of like intrusions that people should be looking out for when they see that kind of like file data? Because one of the things I talked about was RAG, right? Retrieval augmented generation. It grabs unstructured data. Unstructured data, very simply, is a file, right? It can grab file data. So now I'm thinking like, okay, well, what if someone's adding like a PDF of like a bunch of knowledge, and like, how is that going to screw up my RAG, right? Can it do it? Like, what is that going to do? Like, what do people, like, what do you see? What are you seeing out there? What should people look out for?
Sure. So I think the first thing to call out is since because of the way Salesforce is structured, file data cannot be executed within Salesforce, and is a nice security feature of the platform. But whenever that file data is coming down to the browser, so it could be client side, so there could be some client side scripts that execute on that on the files that are being downloaded, or even any files that are being automatically executed on the browser. So I think that's kind of where the big risk is really anything that's coming down to the browser, whether you're previewing images, you're previewing, I think, like you said, any file generation, like the RAG that you're talking about that's generated on the client side, or just downloading files in general. Other things are like sending files out of Salesforce. Maybe you're sending them to a third party, send them to a vendor, maybe like loan aggregators. You do the loan application, they upload their documents, and you send them off, or healthcare aggregators, all that kind of stuff. I think that's kind of where the risk of the threats are. And also URLs. I think that's even a bigger risk, is a lot of URLs coming into Salesforce. You click on those URLs, and then you're basically getting phished within Salesforce. And that's happened to Salesforce customers out there, that the support personnel get phished, and then they get access to all their customer data, or just, it may not be publicized, but we know it happens.
So literally, if I've got like a support community, and if I'm asking them, hey, can you send me a photo of it, that photo itself may be malicious once it's actually viewed by that service person.
Yeah, actually, this is an interesting thing. I've been talking to several people about this, so like the risk of images. I mean, and there are, I think that there's a lot of active scripts that you can put into images, especially like, think of like animated GIFs, and they can even like buffer overflows, and they can actually, typically it's a complex attack where they've planted another file already. And sometimes you can actually have the malicious file inside of the GIF itself, then they have another script that will execute and unload that. So maybe you download the GIF, and it's just a bomb waiting to blow up, and then the attacker plants the other that goes into that GIF file, extracts the virus, and then executes it. So that's kind of images, and then of course you've got executables and a lot of other things there that could be threats.
Yeah. So the threat there is, like we've talked about, guest user and the browser for the guest user a lot. But the threat here is if they upload that file data, and then someone in the console, like the internal employee behind VPN, is now using it. Now they can get all this compromised data.
Yep, exactly. And then also, if you think about the Lightning APIs we were talking about earlier, then there's no one, if you're allowing people to upload files from the guest user, there's no one to stop you doing a mass attack of uploading a large number of files into Salesforce, not even using the UI, or very strategically planting malicious cases and files in Salesforce using automated methods.
All right, cool. Yeah, I don't think a lot of people realize that. Like, it's such an easy thing you're talking about, like, oh, I just need a file associated to your case, and then all of a sudden I've compromised you from behind your VPN.
Yep, exactly. So,
yeah.
Amazing. Well, I don't think there are any questions from the audience. So yeah, okay, cool. Perfect. I'll wrap up the session then. Thank you so much, Matt and Shoby, for taking the time to speak to us today. And thank you everyone in the audience as well for tuning in. Do grab that QR code, grab the links in the chat as well. If you would like to attend the Architect keynote, if you are going to Dreamforce. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of the day. Thanks, everyone. Bye.